You're growing, evolving, finally starting to understand who you really are and what truly matters. You feel like you're, for the first time in your life, walking toward your true purpose. But as you take these steps, something strange and painful happens. The people around you start to pull away, not dramatically, not with arguments or explicit conflicts. It's more subtle than that. It's that friendship that goes cold without explanation. It's the spouse who suddenly seems unable to understand your choices anymore. It's the family that looks at you with a mixture of confusion and judgment. It's the social circle that once welcomed you and now makes you feel invisible or out of place. You wonder if you're doing something wrong, if growing necessarily means being alone, if the price of personal transformation is always loneliness. And the answer isn't simple, but it's liberating when you finally understand it. Abraham Maslow dedicated decades to studying people who achieved what he called self-actualization, that rare stage where you're no longer chasing external validation, obsessive material security, or belonging at any cost. You're living according to your deepest values, exploring your genuine potential, creating real meaning. And one of Maslow's most disturbing discoveries was precisely this. People on the path to self-actualization frequently experience a distancing from those around them. Not because they become arrogant or superior, not because they stop caring about human connections, but because the very process of authentic growth creates an inevitable dissonance with those who still operate from different levels of needs. When you start questioning narratives you've always accepted, when you stop seeking compulsive approval, when you choose meaning over comfort, you inevitably stop resonating with people who still find identity and security in those same narratives, approvals, and comforts. And that hurts, deeply, because you didn't want to lose anyone, you just wanted to grow. Maslow's most controversial discovery wasn't about happiness or success. It was about evolutionary loneliness, and why the most fulfilled people often cross relational deserts before finding their true tribe. Today I'm going to show you exactly why this happens, what Maslow discovered about this phenomenon through years of studying individuals in transformation, and how you can navigate this process without getting lost in guilt or self-destructive isolation. Because there's a crucial difference between healthy growth solitude and toxic fear-based isolation, and understanding that difference can completely change how you live your transformation journey. Maslow studied Eleanor Roosevelt for years. She was one of the most publicly admired figures, but in her private diaries she revealed a profound loneliness that few knew about. When she began challenging the social norms of her time, advocating for civil rights, women's rights, and human dignity in ways that made even her own social class uncomfortable, something predictable happened. The people who once surrounded her, the society ladies who shared her afternoon teas, the political wives who understood the unspoken rules of Washington, slowly disappeared from her life. Not because Eleanor became difficult or unkind, but because she stopped playing by the rules that kept everyone else comfortable. She moved from seeking belonging and esteem within her prescribed social role to pursuing something deeper, self-actualization through meaningful contribution to humanity. And that shift created a chasm between her and nearly everyone she knew. In her own words, she described feeling like she was speaking a language no one around her could understand anymore. The loneliness wasn't a sign she was doing something wrong. It was evidence she was doing something right, but terrifyingly different. What Maslow discovered through studying dozens of self-actualizing individuals like Roosevelt, Albert Einstein, Abraham Lincoln, Jane Addams, and many unknown but deeply fulfilled people was a pattern that repeated itself with striking consistency. The journey toward self-actualization almost always involved a period of social isolation or dramatic relationship transformation. Not because self-actualizing people were antisocial or misanthropic. In fact, Maslow found they often had deeper capacity for love and connection than average. But their relationships fundamentally changed in quality and often drastically reduced in quantity during the transition. The reason lies in understanding how the hierarchy of needs actually operates in real human relationships. Most people bond over shared needs at whatever level they're currently operating from. If you're both focused on safety and security, you bond over fears, protective strategies, insurance policies, stable jobs, avoiding risks. If you're both focused on belonging and love needs, you bond over group identity, shared activities, social validation, fitting in, being accepted. If you're both focused on esteem needs, you bond over achievements, status symbols, recognition, comparing successes, climbing hierarchies. These bonds are real and meaningful within their context. But here's what Maslow discovered that changes everything. When one person begins moving towards self-actualization, they start operating from a fundamentally different psychological framework. They're no longer motivated primarily by security, belonging, or esteem. They're motivated by growth, authenticity, truth, justice, beauty, meaning, potential. And suddenly the conversations that used to bond them to others feel empty. The activities that used to bring connection feel shallow. The values that used to be shared no longer align. Maslow documented this with painful precision in his interviews. One subject, a successful businessman who began pursuing self-actualization in his 40s, described it like this. He said his golf buddies, men he'd spent every Saturday with for 15 years, suddenly felt like strangers. Not because they did anything wrong, but because the conversations that once felt substantial now felt like empty performances. They would talk about quarterly earnings, stock portfolios, who got which promotion, whose kid got into which prestigious school, and he realized none of it touched what he actually cared about anymore. He tried introducing different topics, questions about meaning, purpose, what they were building toward beyond money and status. The responses were awkward silence or jokes that deflected. Within 6 months, the invitation stopped coming. He wasn't excluded maliciously. He simply no longer fit the unspoken agreement of what that group was about. And this pattern repeated across his life. His marriage entered crisis because his wife, operating solidly from esteem needs, couldn't understand why he would consider leaving a prestigious position for work that paid less but felt meaningful. His parents were bewildered and disappointed. His colleagues thought he was having a midlife crisis. The loneliness was crushing. But Maslow's research revealed something crucial. This loneliness wasn't pathological. It was developmental. It was the natural, temporary consequence of outgrowing psychological structures that no longer served his evolution. Think about how a caterpillar transforms into a butterfly. There's a stage inside the chrysalis where the caterpillar literally dissolves. Its body breaks down into a kind of cellular soup before reforming into something completely different. During that dissolution, it's neither caterpillar nor butterfly. It's vulnerable, isolated in between. The journey towards self-actualization has a similar phase. You're no longer who you were, but you haven't fully become who you're becoming. You're in between psychological structures. And during this in-between phase, you often don't fit anywhere. The people operating from lower needs find you confusing or threatening. You haven't yet found the people operating from self-actualization who would understand you. You're alone in the chrysalis, and that's exactly where you need to be for the transformation to complete. Maslow found that people who couldn't tolerate this in-between loneliness, who rushed back to old relationships and old patterns to escape the discomfort, almost never completed the transition to self-actualization. They regressed. They chose comfort over growth. And they spent the rest of their lives with a quiet ache, knowing they abandoned something essential in themselves to keep people around who couldn't meet them where they were going. But here's where it gets more complex and more hopeful. Maslow also discovered that this loneliness wasn't permanent for those who persisted through it. On the other side of the chrysalis phase, self-actualizing people formed new relationships that were qualitatively different and often more satisfying than anything they'd experienced before. These new relationships weren't based on shared insecurities, shared social climbing, or shared need for validation. They were based on shared values, shared commitment to growth, shared appreciation for authenticity, shared capacity for depth. Maslow called these being love relationships versus deficiency love relationships. Deficiency love is when you love someone because they fill a hole in you. They make you feel secure, accepted, esteemed, complete. Being love is when you love someone for who they actually are, and the relationship exists to support both people's growth and self-actualization, rather than to fill deficiencies. Most relationships in society operate from deficiency love because most people are operating from deficiency needs: safety, belonging, esteem. There's nothing wrong with this. It's where most humans naturally exist. But when you move toward self-actualization, you become capable of being love. And being love requires finding other people who are also capable of it. Those people are rare, which is why the journey often feels lonely. You're not losing your capacity for connection. You're developing a capacity for deeper connection that most people simply aren't ready for yet. Let me share another case from Maslow's research that illuminates this perfectly. There was a woman, a teacher in her 30s, who began a deep spiritual and psychological journey after a near-death experience. Before the experience, she was well-liked, socially active, had a wide circle of friends, was engaged to be married. After the experience, something fundamental shifted in her. She described it as suddenly seeing through the games everyone was playing, including herself. The social performances, the image management, the constant seeking of approval and validation, all of it felt suffocating and false. She didn't judge others for it. She understood it was where they were, but she couldn't participate in it anymore with any authenticity. She tried to explain her experience to her fiancé. He listened politely but clearly thought she was going through a temporary phase, maybe depression or trauma response. He kept reassuring her that everything would go back to normal soon. But she knew it wouldn't and shouldn't. She ended the engagement. Her friends rallied around her at first, supportive of her leaving a relationship that wasn't right. But then she kept changing. She quit her stable teaching job to work with underprivileged kids in a way that was meaningful, but financially precarious. She stopped attending the social events that had once structured her weeks. She spent more time alone, reading, reflecting, volunteering. Her friends started saying she'd become weird, too serious, no fun anymore. Invitations dwindled. Within a year, she was essentially alone except for a few scattered connections. Maslow interviewed her 2 years into this journey. She described the loneliness as the hardest thing she'd ever faced, harder than the near-death experience itself. But she also said something striking. She said for the first time in her life she felt like herself. The loneliness was painful, but it was clean pain. The old life had been comfortable, but it was a suffocating comfort, a comfort built on betraying her own truth. She was learning to tolerate the loneliness because the alternative was intolerable, going back to sleep. Now, about 1/3 of the way through this journey we're taking together, I want to pause and ask you something that might be hitting close to home right now. Have you felt this? That confusing, painful experience of growing and simultaneously watching relationships fade? That guilt of wondering if you're being selfish or difficult when you're just trying to be honest about who you're becoming? Look, I know how isolating that feels. How you can be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone because no one seems to understand what you're going through. If this resonates with you, if you've experienced that ache of outgrowing people you love or feeling like you don't fit anywhere anymore, leave a simple comment and just say, "I'm in the chrysalis." That's it, just those 4 words. Your experience might be exactly what someone else scrolling through needs to read today to realize they're not crazy, they're not broken, they're just growing. And that recognition, that moment of feeling seen and less alone, that's more powerful than you realize. You have the power to offer that to someone else right now. So if this speaks to you, drop that comment. I'm in the chrysalis. Let's create a space where people in transformation know they're not walking this path alone. Here's what Maslow identified as the core dynamic that creates this relational loss during self-actualization. It comes down to threat perception at different levels of the hierarchy. When you start operating from self-actualization, you inadvertently threaten the psychological structures of people still operating from lower needs. And I don't mean you're trying to threaten them or being aggressive. Your mere existence, your choices, your questions, your new way of being, it all threatens the worldview they need to feel safe, to feel belonging, to feel esteemed. Let me break this down concretely. If someone's primary need is safety and security, and they've built their entire life around maximizing predictability and minimizing risk, then your decision to leave a secure job for meaningful but uncertain work threatens their worldview. If it's possible to do what you're doing and be okay, then maybe all their choices driven by fear weren't necessary. Maybe they've been playing it safe unnecessarily. That thought is terrifying and unacceptable. So instead of examining their own choices, they judge yours. They tell you you're being irresponsible, reckless, naive. They distance themselves from you because you represent a possibility they can't afford to consider without their entire psychological structure collapsing. It's not personal, it's protective, but it results in you being alone. The same dynamic operates at the belonging level. If someone's primary need is to fit in, to be accepted by a particular group, to maintain their position in a social hierarchy, then your decision to speak your truth even when it's unpopular, to violate unspoken social rules, to choose authenticity over acceptance, that threatens their entire strategy for meeting their needs. If you can survive, even thrive, outside the group's approval, then what does that say about all the compromises they're making to stay in good standing? What does it say about all the parts of themselves they're suppressing to fit in? Again, these are questions they can't afford to ask, so they handle the threat by excluding you, by labeling you as difficult or too intense or not a team player. You're exiled not because you did anything to them, but because you represent a psychological danger to their way of meeting their needs. And at the esteem level, if someone's primary need is to achieve status, recognition, prestige, to climb hierarchies and accumulate symbols of success, then your decision to define success differently, to value internal fulfillment over external accomplishment, to step off the ladder they're desperately climbing, that's deeply threatening. It suggests their ladder might be leaning against the wrong wall. It suggests all their striving might be for something that doesn't actually lead to fulfillment. That possibility is intolerable, so they handle it by dismissing you. You're wasting your potential. You're settling. You don't have ambition anymore. The distance grows. You lose them not because you changed, but because you changed in a direction that questions the foundation of how they're living. Maslow documented case after case of this dynamic. A minister who moved from preaching comfortable doctrine to speaking uncomfortable truth lost his congregation. A scientist who moved from pursuing prestigious publications to pursuing meaningful research that wouldn't impress tenure committees lost professional respect. A mother who moved from performing perfect motherhood for social media validation to actually connecting with her kids in messy, authentic ways lost her mommy group friends. The pattern is relentless. Growth threatens those not growing, not because growing people are trying to be threatening, but because growth itself exposes the limitations of where others are choosing to stay. And most people, when faced with that exposure, choose to eliminate the mirror rather than look at what it's reflecting. They eliminate you from their life, and you're left standing there wondering what you did wrong. You didn't do anything wrong. You just grew. And growth is threatening to stagnation. But here's the part that Maslow emphasized that keeps this from being just a depressing reality about human nature. The loneliness of the chrysalis phase serves a crucial developmental purpose. It forces you to develop internal validation, internal direction, internal security. As long as you're dependent on external sources for your sense of okayness, for your sense of direction, for your sense of worth, you cannot fully self-actualize. Self-actualization by definition means your self is actualizing. Your true self is becoming real and operational in the world. But if you're constantly shaping that self to maintain external approval, you're not actualizing yourself. You're actualizing some performed version designed to keep others comfortable. The loneliness breaks that dependence. When there's no one around to validate you, when there's no group to tell you you're on the right path, when there's no external authority confirming your choices, you're forced to develop your own internal compass. You're forced to learn what Maslow called autonomy, the capacity to be self-directing, to validate yourself, to trust your own experience and judgment even when it contradicts what everyone around you believes. This is terrifying. Most people never develop real autonomy. They go from parental authority to peer authority to cultural authority to expert authority, always looking outside themselves for permission and direction. The chrysalis loneliness is where you finally, necessarily, develop the capacity to be your own authority. And that capacity is non-negotiable for self-actualization. Maslow found that every self-actualizing person he studied had gone through a period, sometimes years, of what he called aloneness. Not loneliness in the sense of feeling incomplete or desperately wanting connection, but aloneness in the sense of being fundamentally okay without external validation, capable of standing alone if necessary, not dependent on others for their sense of identity or worth. This aloneness wasn't about being antisocial or isolated. Many self-actualizing people had rich social lives, but the quality was different. They enjoyed people but didn't need people to feel complete. They loved deeply but weren't desperately attached. They contributed to community but weren't defined by their role in any group. They had achieved what psychologists call differentiation, the capacity to be intimately connected while remaining a separate, autonomous self. And that capacity is forged in the fire of the chrysalis loneliness. You cannot develop it while still embedded in relationships that validate you for staying who you've always been. You can only develop it by surviving the terror of being alone with becoming who you actually are. Now let's talk about Viktor Frankl, another figure Maslow studied extensively. Frankl survived Nazi concentration camps and emerged with profound insights about human meaning and purpose. But what most people don't know is that after the war, when Frankl began teaching his ideas about logotherapy and man's search for meaning, he faced intense criticism and isolation from the psychiatric establishment. His colleagues thought he was being unscientific, too philosophical, not properly Freudian. He was marginalized professionally for years. Speaking engagements dried up. Publications rejected his papers. He faced the very real possibility that his life's work would die in obscurity. Maslow interviewed Frankl during this period. Frankl described the isolation as agonizing, but he also said something that became central to Maslow's understanding of self-actualization. Frankl said when external validation disappeared, he was forced to ask himself a simple question: is this true? Is what I'm teaching and discovering about human meaning and suffering actually true based on my experience and observation? And if it's true, does it matter whether anyone else recognizes it right now? His answer was yes, it's true, and no. External recognition doesn't change that truth. That internal certainty, that capacity to hold truth even when standing completely alone, that's the essence of self-actualization. Years later, Frankl's work became internationally recognized. His book became one of the most influential psychology texts of the 20th century. But the recognition came after he had already developed the internal autonomy to stand without it. The loneliness had done its work. It had transformed him from someone who needed validation to someone who could generate his own sense of meaning and purpose regardless of external response. Maslow identified several stages people typically go through during this relational transformation on the path to self-actualization. Stage 1 is the awakening, where you first begin to question the scripts you've been living and realize you've been operating from needs for safety, belonging, or esteem, rather than from your authentic self. This stage often feels exciting and liberating. You have energy, curiosity, hope. Stage 2 is the disruption, where your new awareness and choices start creating friction in existing relationships. People notice you're changing. They express concern or criticism. You try to explain, but find yourself speaking a language they don't understand. This stage is confusing and often leads to doubt. Maybe you're wrong. Maybe you should go back. Stage 3 is the grief, where you realize that some relationships genuinely cannot survive your transformation, not because anyone is bad or wrong, but because the foundation of the connection no longer exists. This is where the deep loneliness sets in. You're mourning losses while simultaneously knowing you can't go back. This stage is brutal. Many people get stuck here in bitterness or depression. Stage 4 is the acceptance, where you stop fighting the loneliness and start accepting it as a necessary part of your journey. You develop compassion for those who can't come with you and for yourself for the pain of it. You start learning to be alone without feeling like something is wrong. Stage 5 is the emergence, where you begin attracting new connections that match where you are now rather than where you were. These new relationships feel different, deeper, more authentic, less performative. You start building a new community around shared values and shared commitment to growth. And stage 6 is the integration, where you've established yourself solidly in self-actualization, with relationships that support and reflect that. And you can reconnect with some old relationships from a place of autonomy rather than dependence, where you're no longer threatened by their different level of needs and they're no longer threatened by your growth. Not everyone makes it through all 6 stages. Maslow found that most people retreat somewhere between stage 2 and 4. The pain of disruption, grief, and loneliness becomes too much. They choose known comfort over unknown growth. And there's no judgment in that. It's a legitimate choice based on what feels survivable. But for those who persist through the full journey, what emerges on the other side is a quality of life and relationship that most people never experience. A life built on truth rather than performance. Relationships built on authentic connection rather than mutual need-filling. A sense of purpose that comes from within rather than from external validation. And a capacity to contribute to the world in meaningful ways because you're no longer consumed by the exhausting work of maintaining false selves to keep others comfortable. Here's what I want you to understand that Maslow emphasized in all his work on this subject. Losing people on the path to self-actualization is not about becoming better than them or outgrowing them in some superior sense. It's about developing different operating systems that are no longer compatible with certain kinds of relationships. Your old friends aren't bad people. Your family isn't wrong for not understanding. Your former partner isn't deficient for not being able to come with you. They're operating from different needs, using different psychological strategies, living in different paradigms. And that's okay. The loss is real and painful, but it doesn't mean anyone failed. It means you're on different paths that no longer run parallel. Maslow stressed that self-actualizing people needed to release judgment, both of others and of themselves. Judging others for not growing keeps you bitter and stuck. Judging yourself for growing keeps you guilty and stuck. Neither serves your actualization. What serves it is compassionate acceptance of reality. Some people will come with you. Most won't. Both are okay. Your job is not to convince anyone or to shrink yourself back down to maintain connection. Your job is to keep growing and to trust that the right connections will form around who you're actually becoming rather than who you used to be. Let me give you one more case that brings this full circle. Maslow studied a man named Andrew, a corporate attorney in his 50s who had achieved everything his family and culture defined as success. Partnership at a prestigious firm, beautiful home, respected position in his community. But he felt empty, completely empty. He described it as living in a beautiful prison where all his needs for security, status, and approval were met, but his soul was dying. He started therapy, began deep inner work, and realized he'd spent his entire adult life living someone else's definition of success. He wanted to do legal aid work, to help people who couldn't afford representation, to use his skills for something that actually mattered to him. His wife, who had built her identity around being married to a successful corporate attorney, couldn't understand and didn't support the change. His partners at the firm saw it as professional suicide. His parents were devastated that he would throw away everything they'd sacrificed to help him achieve. He made the change anyway, left the firm, took a position at a legal aid nonprofit making a fraction of his former salary. His marriage ended. His former colleagues stopped inviting him to professional events. His parents barely spoke to him for 2 years. Maslow interviewed him 3 years into this new life. Andrew described those 3 years as simultaneously the loneliest and most alive he'd ever felt. He said the loneliness was real and sometimes overwhelming, but it was nothing compared to the soul death of his previous life. He was finally himself, finally doing work that aligned with his deepest values, finally living with integrity even though it cost him nearly every relationship he had. And then something unexpected happened. He met a woman who was also doing work she believed in, underpaid but meaningful. They connected on a level he'd never experienced in his marriage. He formed friendships with other people at the nonprofit who were motivated by mission rather than money. He found a community of people at a meditation center where growth and authenticity were valued over status. 3 years after losing everyone, he had built a completely new web of relationships that actually fit who he had become, and when his parents finally came around and rebuilt connection with him, it was on new terms. He wasn't performing for their approval anymore. He was just himself, and they could accept that or not. They chose acceptance. The relationship improved dramatically because it was finally based on reality rather than performance. Andrew told Maslow something that became one of the core insights in Maslow's later work. He said you can't take old relationships built on an old self into a new life built on a new self and expect them to work. The architecture doesn't match. You either rebuild the relationship from scratch with a new foundation, which is rare but possible, or you release it and build new relationships that match your new foundation. Trying to force old relationships to accommodate your new self usually results in either you shrinking back down or the relationship becoming toxic with resentment and misunderstanding. The healthiest path, though the most painful initially, is to release what no longer fits and trust that what does fit will emerge. And Maslow's research confirmed this over and over. People who successfully navigated to self-actualization accepted the losses, mourned them, learned from them, and moved forward. People who got stuck in self-actualization tried to force old relationships to work or isolated themselves permanently out of bitterness. Neither extreme served growth. So what do you do with all of this if you're currently in that painful space of losing people as you grow? First, normalize it. You're not broken. You're not doing it wrong. You're experiencing a predictable developmental challenge that every person who genuinely grows faces. The loneliness is not evidence of failure. It's evidence of transformation. Second, resist the urge to rush back to comfort by shrinking yourself or by settling for relationships that require you to be less than you're becoming. The temporary discomfort of loneliness is better than the permanent soul death of self-betrayal. Third, actively develop your capacity for aloneness. Spend time with yourself. Get comfortable with your own company. Build internal validation. Learn to trust your own judgment and experience. This is where your autonomy develops. Fourth, be patient with the emergence of new connections. They will come, but you can't force them or rush them. Focus on becoming who you're meant to be, and the right people will be attracted to that authenticity. Fifth, practice compassion for those who can't come with you and for yourself, for the pain of it. No one is the villain in this story. Everyone is just operating from where they are. And finally, trust the process. The chrysalis phase doesn't last forever. You will emerge. You will find your people. You will build a life that reflects your true self. But you have to go through the dissolution first. You have to be willing to be alone in becoming before you can be connected in being. Maslow spent his career studying the rare individuals who made it to self-actualization. And one of his most consistent findings was this: they all went through fire. They all faced loss. They all spent time in the wilderness of transformation where they stood essentially alone with their becoming. And they all said retrospectively that it was worth it. The loneliness was temporary. The life they built on the other side was permanent. The relationships they formed in self-actualization were deeper and more satisfying than anything they'd known before. The sense of purpose and meaning they developed sustained them through challenges that would have broken their former selves. They became more resilient, more creative, more capable of love, more able to contribute meaningfully to the world. But they had to lose the old life to gain the new one. They had to be willing to stand alone in the truth of who they were becoming even when everyone around them preferred who they used to be. That willingness, that courage to endure the chrysalis loneliness, that's what separated those who actualized from those who stayed stuck in comfortable but soul-deadening patterns. You're at a choice point if you're experiencing this right now. You can retreat back to comfort, back to relationships that feel safe but require you to be small, back to a life that meets your basic needs but leaves your deepest self unrealized. Or you can keep walking forward into the uncomfortable unknown, trusting that on the other side of this loneliness is a life and a set of relationships that actually match who you truly are. Both choices are valid. Both have costs. But only one leads to self-actualization. Only one leads to living from your deepest truth. Only one leads to looking back on your life and knowing you became who you were meant to become, rather than who was convenient to be. Maslow believed that the need to self-actualize, to become fully yourself, to realize your potential, is as real and as powerful as the need for safety or belonging. But it's a need that emerges later, that requires the courage to face fears that safety-seeking and belonging-seeking help us avoid. It requires accepting that you might stand alone, that you might lose people, that growth might cost you everything comfortable, and then choosing growth anyway. Not because you don't value relationships, but because you value truth and authenticity and becoming yourself more than you value comfortable relationships that require you to stay who you've always been. Eleanor Roosevelt, after years of that painful loneliness we talked about at the beginning, eventually found her people. She built relationships with civil rights activists, social reformers, other women who had broken free from society's constraints. Those relationships sustained her through the rest of her life, but she had to lose the country club friends first. She had to endure being judged and misunderstood. She had to develop the strength to stand alone before she could stand with others who truly saw her. Viktor Frankl's work eventually found its audience, but only after he'd developed the internal certainty to keep teaching it when no one was listening. Andrew found love and community again, but only after he'd lost everything built on false foundation and rebuilt on solid ground. The pattern is consistent. The chrysalis loneliness is not the end of the story. It's the middle. It's the necessary dissolution before reformation. It's the dark night before dawn. But you have to stay in it. You have to resist the urge to abort the transformation and crawl back into being a caterpillar, because at least caterpillars have other caterpillars around them. If you abort in the chrysalis, you don't get to be a butterfly. You just get to be a damaged caterpillar wondering what might have been. I know this is heavy. I know if you're living this right now, it feels overwhelming. You might be questioning everything, wondering if growth is worth this price, feeling the very real grief of losing people you love. That's all valid. That's all part of the process. But here's what I want you to hold on to. Thousands of people before you have walked this exact path. They've felt this exact loneliness. They've questioned these exact questions. And those who kept walking, who trusted the process, who developed their autonomy and waited for new connections to emerge, they made it through. They built lives of profound meaning and satisfaction. They became themselves. And you can too. You are not alone in this loneliness. Millions of people across history and across the world right now are in the same chrysalis, going through the same dissolution, facing the same fears. We're all in this together even when we feel completely isolated. The path to self-actualization is walked by individuals, but it's walked by many individuals. You're part of a lineage of humans who chose growth over comfort, truth over performance, becoming over belonging. That lineage holds you even when no one in your immediate life understands what you're going through. Look, you've been on quite a journey with me through these ideas today. If you've made it this far, something in this message resonated with where you are in your own life. And I want you to know that this conversation doesn't have to end here. This channel exists specifically for people like you. People who are asking the deeper questions, who are willing to face uncomfortable truths, who are committed to becoming who they actually are, rather than who they're supposed to be. Every week I explore psychological insights, transformation processes, and the real human struggles of growth with the same depth and honesty we've shared today. If you felt seen in this video, if you felt less alone in your own chrysalis loneliness, I want to invite you to continue this journey together. Hit that subscribe button not just to get more content, but to join a community of people who value truth and growth and authenticity. Think of it as marking yourself as someone in transformation, someone willing to face the hard stuff, someone on the path even when the path feels lonely. We're building something here, a space where people in chrysalis can recognize each other, support each other, remind each other that the dissolution is temporary and the emergence is coming. I'd be honored to have you as part of that ongoing conversation. So subscribe, turn on notifications, and know that you're not walking this path alone anymore. And if you want to go even deeper into Maslow's work, next week I'm exploring why people who reach the top of the hierarchy sometimes crash all the way back down to level 1, and what that teaches us about the fragility of self-actualization. It's a topic that will challenge everything you think you know about personal growth and success. You won't want to miss it. Remember, losing people on the path to self-actualization doesn't mean you're becoming someone unlikable or difficult. It means you're becoming someone real. And real is threatening to people still living in performance. But real is also the only way to actually live before you die. The chrysalis is dark and lonely, but it's temporary. The butterfly is coming. Keep growing, keep trusting, keep becoming. I'll see you in the next one.